we're going to take a look at the origins of MVC. Where did it come from? How did it start off? Then we're going to take a look at the state of MVC in JavaScript right now. And we're going to wrap up by, first of all, taking a look at another new JavaScript framework that tries to be a little closer to the original form of MVC that was first created and defined. And then we're going to have a little panel discussion. I think this is a small enough room. If there are people later on that want to come up and have the panel discussion, feel free to. Otherwise, I'm happy to shout across the room. So before we get started, how many people here were born after 1978? Just out of interest. Okay. So about half the room. Okay. MVC was first conceived in 1978. To give you an idea of how long ago that was, so 34 years ago, to give you an idea of how long ago that was the year that asteroids first came out. It was the year that Apple first released their DAWs toolkit. It was also the year that the 5¼ floppy disk came out, to give you an idea of how long ago this particular pattern was first crafted. And yet 34 years on, we're still using it. 1978 was also the year where Sean Connery was allowed to dress like a male hooker in a movie. Oh, dear God. But today we're going to explore the origins of MVC. How has it drifted away from what it was originally? Why has that happened? Have people been abusing the term MVC in the industry to create lots of new libraries and frameworks, or have they been evolving it in the way that it needs to go in order to help us build web applications? So some people that tweeted back to me when I said that I was going to give this talk asked, the real MVC or the confused current application of MVC that most frameworks abuse? This is like asking what I'm going to be talking about. I'm going to talk about both. But I thought a little bit about the word abuse. And is it really abuse or is it evolution? And we're going to discuss this later on. So if anyone during the talk thinks, I've got some strong viewpoints about this stuff, again, please feel free to come down. We can talk about it later. Some very quick information about me. I work at Google as a developer programs engineer. I can't tell you too much about what I do right now, but I am developing tools that will hopefully help developers create JavaScript applications a little bit more easily. When I tell people that I work at Google, they think that this is what I spend my time doing all day. It's actually more like this. In case anyone's wondering, I am the person swimming away from the shark and not the shark, acquisitions aside. Right, I love working for Google. I have to cover my ass there. I also love writing. I don't know, you may have seen something that I've written before in its terrible, terrible, untechnically reviewed form, but I'm currently working on 2 books. The first is on JavaScript design patterns, which will cover a little bit of what we're going to be talking about today, and the other is on Backbone. They're both going to be hopefully getting wrapped up in the next couple of months. Now, when I tell people that I enjoy writing books, they usually think the quality of those books is going to be a little bit like this, something of a refined masterpiece. The reality is that most of my books would actually look like this, a hideous monstrosity. I spend my time contributing to open source libraries and projects, and I've created things like To Do MVC and jQuery UI Bootstrap and a bunch of other stuff. I think we're in a good position in 2012. Developers now realize the importance of having structured, organized, maintainable code. This wasn't the case a few years ago in JavaScript. People were still complaining and bickering about the idea of, well, wait a minute, I like using jQuery. Well, I like using Dojo. You can easily interchange the two. And that was the argument. That was the whole big argument we had years and years ago. Now we realize that the Dojo guys were actually right. jQuery is great for just a DOM manipulation library, and if you want to put together something that is going to cover a little more of your needs when you're developing complex applications, you have to have other bits and pieces in your toolkit. You are going to need some sort of thing helping you with the structure of your application. You're going to need a lot of other bits and pieces that are going to take care of greater concerns. Now, we're in a good position. So over the past 2 or 3 years, there have been a lot of different frameworks that have come out. We've had Backbone, Ember, Batman.js, AngularJS, a ton of other things. But we're in a position now where we have over 40 JavaScript MVC frameworks that are here to help us. And unfortunately, many of these don't actually use MVC. They label themselves as MVC, and they try to sell themselves as MVC so that we'll go and use them, and we'll say, hey, I'm using a hot new MVC framework. It's much smaller than the others. But in reality, a lot of them either don't completely understand how MVC is supposed to be structured, or they purposely change what it is to fit their own needs. This isn't necessarily a bad thing. We'll get to this a little bit later. I was in this position about a year and a half ago where I saw that there were probably 20 or 30 different MVC frameworks, and I found it really, really hard to figure out what I should be using. There was Backbone, Ember.js back then was still Sprout Core, and I found it really, really challenging trying to figure out the differences between these different frameworks. And so I put together this project called To Do MVC. And the idea behind this was quite simple. You have a simple application that you implement using all of these different frameworks, and it allows you, it's supposed to allow you to easily compare them. So if I want to see how Backbone has implemented models, and I want to compare that to how Ember.js has done it, I'd open up the To-Do application, check the implementation for, say, the to-do list or something like that, and I'd easily be able to compare the syntax and the approach that the library has taken to implementing models, which is a simple enough concept. This is only a very small list of what we actually support. This is like Labs, which has got a ton of other libraries in there, and I think we're probably going to end up supporting 30 or 40 frameworks by our next release, which is kind of crazy. There's a problem with MVC in the JavaScript world right now. MVC is a design pattern, right? And design patterns are supposed to be a common vocabulary to help us describe things. So when I say what MVC is, people are supposed to get, okay, well, it's all about decoupling your architecture. It's about separating your concerns into 3 distinct pieces. Unfortunately, when libraries take MVC and they label themselves MVC when they aren't, it can make it a little bit more difficult for people to actually understand what's going on. Everybody seems to have their own definition of this. They all have their own take on how separation of concerns should manifest. I'll give you an example of Backbone. Later on, we're going to go through a few different frameworks and actually take a look at how they've implemented these things. But let's talk about Backbone for a moment. So Backbone has this concept of models. It's got its concept of views. It's absolutely fine. That's MVC. But then it's got this idea of collections rather than having a controller. In Backbone, the view is both a view and it's also a controller, meaning that it takes care of both what the user is actually going to see, so what's rendered as the output, as well as the user interaction. And yet we still call it MVC. There's something wrong with that. I love Backbone, by the way, but there is something wrong with that. A while back, I think back in January, I was having a conversation with another JavaScript developer named Peter Michels, and I said, I don't think enough developers fully understand MVC, or they probably know that it's easy enough to implement it without using a framework. And I stand by that. Any time in my career that I found it implement it myself. The idea isn't to create yet another library that I'm going to stick out there. It's not going to be maintained, and people are just going to wonder whether it's going to die or not. The idea is to teach myself how something actually works. And at the end, sometime during this week or this month, if you have time, I would actually say go and try implementing your own framework. Don't release it, but go try implementing it just to see how everything actually works behind the scenes. You'll get a far better appreciation for MVC and how people should be structuring applications as a result of it. Please, please, please don't release it as a public library. I already have to maintain 40 different MVC implementations. If I have to maintain yours, I'm going to find where you live and kick you. Right. I do, however, prescribe to this idea. Every developer should build an MVC framework from scratch, and the trick isn't to release it or use it for real work. It's for academic purposes, so for you to learn how everything works. Now, since 1980, we've had a great deal of change in terms of what MVC is used for. First of all, we had MVC. So we had the Smalltalk version of MVC that came out in 1978. Then we had MVP. We've got Web MVC, Web MVP, MVVM, and then we've got JavaScript MVC. Consider since 1978 how many different programming languages people have been using. MVC has been implemented in C++, in C#, in PHP, Java, JSP, all that stuff. And people have had to try to figure out how to adapt this old pattern to fit modern paradigms. How do you fit it to actually work with the web? And this is the big challenge. That other programming languages have had this problem, and JavaScript is now having this problem as well. How do we actually fit this old paradigm, this old idea of separating concerns, into something that wasn't really meant to be used for it? So let's start off with MVC. We're going to go into this in greater detail. I'm going to talk about Smalltalk very soon. But basic description. MVC provides us a clean separation of concerns where data, presentation, and user input are handled separately. It's a very, very basic concept. Very easy to get wrong if you start taking it and adapting it and augmenting it to mean something completely different. But that's the idea. We've got models, we've got views, and we've got controllers. Then we've got the model view presenter pattern. And it was supposed to be a little bit like MVC, but people wanted to be able to decouple the way that they created user interfaces. So if I wanted one team, for example, to be working on the user interface, and I wanted another team to be focusing on the logic behind that interface, MVP is what I'd be using. It's actually a pattern that's quite popular at Google, and I believe it's used in GWT, amongst other things. So the idea here is that the presenter plays the role of the controller, and the view handles user input. The presenter also retrieves data from your model, and it formats it for display in the view. It's slightly different to MVC, but you can still see that there are parts of this that are still there. So you've got your model, you've got your view. Then we've got MVVM, which is, again, was a little bit like MVC, but it provided data bindings between your model and your view. It converted your model data and passed it on to the view for other usage. And if you remember what I was just saying, this is actually a little bit similar to what we're doing with the presenter. The presenter retrieves data and it formats it for display. And here, again, we're converting model and passing it on to the view for usage. So we're formatting once again. And then we've got variations on these patterns. We've got the MVC frameworks that we've got today. They borrow aspects from MVC, from MVP, from MVVM, and they don't exactly know where they should be fitting them into. And so they're like, okay, well, what I've created is sort of close enough to MVC for me to call it that, maybe. Others will, without sort of knowing, say it's MVC when it's actually something completely different. Backbone.js is actually an MVP framework. But if you read their docs, they will say it's an MVC framework. They're wrong. So effectively what we're doing in the industry at the moment, or at least over the past year or two, is we've been taking classic patterns and trying to shape them to work with the web. Sometimes this works well. I'm not going to say that people haven't been able to create rich, complex applications that are well organized using these modern frameworks. People have. You'll find tons and tons of examples of them. But unless you fully understand how these things actually work, you can find yourself slipping and, again, trying to fit things into places where they're not going to. This is one of the reasons I try to understand these patterns as best as I can. So Backbone.js isn't really MVC. AngularJS, go Google, is not entirely MVC. And neither is anything else down there either. These are really great frameworks. Some of these are really amazing, and I know the authors of many of them, but they're not MVC in its classic form. And why should you care about classic MVC? I fundamentally believe that when you understand patterns properly, they can help you use these frameworks better. If you go and you speak to people who are contributing code to Backbone.js, you actually find that they don't use it in the exact same way that many of us do. They fully understand that, okay, well, maybe it's a little bit more like MVP, and maybe I should be reading literature related to that and saying, okay, well, how do I best fit this into that paradigm? In theory, understanding this stuff is going to help you. So let's talk about Smalltalk MVC. This is the original MVC before anybody did anything mean to it. So you have models, views, and controllers. The idea behind models was that they were supposed to represent domain-specific knowledge and data. So let's say we have an application like Facebook. I'm not allowed to say Facebook. Google+. Right. So let's say we've got Google+. And it's sort of like Facebook. And it's got this idea of media. So when you post something on Google+, it could be a video, it could be a picture, but it's a piece of media. That's something specific to the domain of the application that you're creating. And that could be represented by a model. Similarly, a post, a status update. That could be another type of model. It's going to have information related to the URL that you're posting, if you're posting one, some text content, any people that you're including as a CC on that post as well. But it's a fairly clear idea. Now, models have to notify people when something happens to them using the observer pattern. The idea here is that you have views observing models, and so models don't directly communicate with anybody. They're just there to handle data. When something changes on the server, so let's say I've got models that are synchronized with models on the server, data on the server. When that data changes and my model gets updated, I need to be able to tell the views in my application that something has changed. They then need to be able to go and update the data on the page if necessary, if that's what they want to do. But this is using the observer pattern. I'm not going to go too much into detail into the observer pattern, but for anybody that hasn't come across it before, you may have also seen this implemented using the publish-subscribe pattern, which is not the exact same thing, but it's quite similar. But the idea is that rather than directly communicating with parts of your application, you just publish an event saying, okay, well, something has happened, and let other observers react based on that. And models are supposed to be isolated from the view, but they're modified by the controller. I'll talk about this more in just a second. Here's a problem that happened a few years ago. People saw Smalltalk, and they understood, okay, well, we've got this nice concept of MVC. Cool. Now, there's actually a few different types of models that you can have. There's domain models. And the idea behind domain models is what we just talked about, the idea of data representing core concepts in your app, so photographs, contacts, friends. And then some people thought, okay, well, maybe I need an application model. Maybe I need something that knows about views and when they need data and can communicate with them directly. And this is one of those places where things started going wrong. People started interswitching the idea of a domain model with an application model. And they started trying to structure their applications in a way where the M part wasn't really a model in the way that we think it should be. Then you've got views, and views are interesting. So views are often considered the UI, so what is actually presented to the user. They don't have to be visible, though. You could easily have tons and tons of dynamic views which are never actually rendered on the page. They can exist there, they can interact with controllers, they can observe models, they can do all sorts of stuff, but they don't actually have to be visible. They don't have to have some sort of UI. Views, though, have to know about the existence of models in order to observe them. You can't just say, okay, hit me with some data, when you don't know what it is that's going to be hitting you with data. Another interesting thing is that they have to know something about the model's nature. So what is it that the view is actually looking for that's changing in the model? In a photograph, maybe it's the source. Maybe you've changed the photograph. Maybe you've updated what photograph that is. Maybe you've changed the caption or the date or some other piece of data about it. And the view needs to be able to keep an eye on these things so it can correctly update and make sure that the user has the most recent version of that data, if that's one of its design goals, making sure that they have the most recent view of that data. And you can have this idea of multiple views existing for single models. So let's say that we were modeling not a Facebook page, but a Google Plus page. Right, so let's say we're modeling a Google Plus page, and we have a ton of data about a user. We've got profile data, we know what your favorite music is, your favorite movies, all of that other stuff. Let's say that that all exists as a single model. Let's say it's just user profile model. Now, multiple views might be things like, okay, well, what's the user's favorite set of movies? What's the user's favorite set of music? And what are likes and dislikes and all that stuff? But you can have multiple views for just one model. You don't have to have a model for every single view. In the same way, I've developed applications, complex applications, where I've only had one or two views. So don't get bogged down with this idea that you have to have views for every single thing in your application. You can actually reuse components and reuse views as much as you want. Then we've got controllers. And the idea behind the controller is that it's supposed to receive input and instruct views to respond accordingly. So controllers handle your input and views handle your output. That's a major simplification of what's going on, but that's the basic idea. Now, when the controller changes your model state, it doesn't directly tell this to the view. The controller is only responsible for updating the model state. So let's say I'm editing something on the page and I change my model. That's it for the controller. It's not responsible for doing anything else. The model itself has to then go and broadcast and say, okay, well, maybe my caption has been changed. And the view then has to go and do something with that data, be it just ignore it or actually re-render the view. And then we have this place where you can find some dragons. Some implementations merge the idea of the controller and the view completely. And this isn't in Smalltalk. This is where I start talking about Backbone. Backbone, for example, my favorite MVC library does this. It merges the controller and the view completely. And this means that we almost end up ignoring 30 years worth of experience in the industry and what actually works in MVC or MVP, because they seem to be prescribing the fact that they're doing MVC when they're not. And this is another sort of summary from Peter Michels. Smalltalk views are about painting and maintaining a bitmap. JavaScript views are about building and maintaining a DOM element. And if you've ever used, so how many people here have used JavaScript MVC frameworks before? I should have asked earlier, so almost everybody. Excellent. So you understand this quite well. The challenge is that Smalltalk is not equal to JavaScript. It's not the same thing. It's a completely different paradigm, different place to be working in. So how do we apply this to a JavaScript application? Well, it's actually quite simple. So let's say we've got a bunch of spaghetti code and we're trying to make it fit this particular pattern. So what unique data is represented in your application? That's the first thing you need to consider. Is it a picture? Is it a person? Is it a piece of text or a status update? Each of those things can be represented as a model. You then need to see what it is the user is going to be able to view. Are they going to be able to edit these models? Do they have the ability to view different takes on this data? Are they able to filter? Are they able to search? All of that stuff. The actual UI presented to the user should be through the view. In JavaScript terms, you also want to ideally, and this isn't in pattern literature, but it's just common sense, figure out what repeatable output you can shift from your code to your JavaScript templating. So, for example, if we're talking about building Flickr, Google Picasa. Okay, let's say we're building Picasa, and you're trying to shift everything to JavaScript templating. What is that? Let's say we've got gallery views. You've got a gallery containing tons and tons of different images. All of that stuff can easily be shifted to JavaScript templating. There was no reason anyone should be using concatenation and all of that messy stuff in their code to get this working, because JavaScript templating can do it, A, more efficiently, and B, it's a lot easier to work with, and it's a lot more readable. Then you've got your controllers. And in JavaScript MVC frameworks, the role really, really varies quite a lot, but it typically should be handling your user interaction. So if I'm clicking something in my interface, in my application, and I'm trying to change something, all of those actions like clicks and mouse overs and all of that stuff, you can have your controllers handle those. Now let's go back to frameworks and MVStar. So I probably should have explained earlier, these days we describe most of these frameworks, these backbone, the spine, JavaScript MVC, we describe them as MVStar. We don't call them MVC. If you know about this stuff, don't call it MVC, don't call it MVP or MVVM, it's MVStar. Most of them have a model, most of them have a view, but then they go and they have these other components that mostly don't fit into a controller. And there's nothing wrong with that, but just make sure that when you say something is MVC, it's actually MVC. Otherwise, you might have users going and trying to figure out, okay, well, it says this application is structured using MVC. I'm going to go read this article from 2002 that's longer than any other one about MVC. Oh, wait, none of this matches. So Backbone, what does Backbone do? So Backbone's models, we're going to do this for a few different frameworks, just for kicks. All right, so Backbone has models, views, collections, and routers. Models are okay. They're domain-level data structures. That's the exact same thing as Smalltalk. We don't have to worry about that. Its views are both user interface and the interaction, the part that we're supposed to be using controllers for. So we need to bear that in mind. And it's closer actually to the controller idea, like the P in MVP, than it is MVC. We then have collections. And this is something that is completely separate to MVC at all. Most MVC frameworks will try to have this idea of lists of models so that you can easily group them. Backbone calls theirs collections. And then you've got routers, which are, again, not part of MVC, but they're relevant enough to the way that we build applications that I'm going to keep them in there. Backbone has that too. And these pipe back to fairly sane constructs. You've got backbone.model, backbone.view, backbone.collection, backbone.router. Now, in MVC terms, in to-do MVC terms, I'm not entirely sure if any of this is even visible. Let me pad up the size a little bit. But in to-do MVC terms, this stuff sort of makes sense, right? We're basically extending backbone.model. We're setting some defaults. We're initializing and doing something when the model first starts up. Toggle clear is basically going to clear any data that we have in there. That's fair enough. Get down. This is the list concept that I was talking about. And I'm still not sure if anybody can see this stuff. Can you guys see this stuff at the back? You can? Cool. All right. So then we've got this idea of grouping together models, and this is sort of backbone.collection, which is the same thing. So we're just specifying what model it is that we're creating as a list, and then specifying our custom behavior on top of that. View is very similar. Backbone.view.extend, set what element it is that you're working with. So if you remember Peter Michels' comment from before, we're basically working with a particular element or set of elements. You've got some templating in here, which completely makes sense, event handling, etc. Now, remember when we said that we're supposed to have logic to do with user interaction in a controller? This is where Backbone actually sort of mixes them up. So we've got backbone.view. All right, so this stuff is fine. This stuff is more or less dealing with the view. Then we've got all of the events object. And this is the part that starts becoming a little bit more like a controller. And if you scroll down, all of these correspond to different events. All of this is basically a controller. It's not a view. You'd normally never find any of that stuff in the view. And it's the exact same situation with the other views that we have in this application. Let's get back. Ember. So Ember's models are also similar to Smalltalk. It's not the exact same. So we have domain level data. We've got relationships between models. That's fine. That's, you could say that that's the same concept as Smalltalk. Your views are HTML templates, which again makes sense in the context of creating JavaScript applications. Your controllers manage lists of objects. Now, does anyone notice that this is essentially the same thing as a collection almost, even though it's called a controller? And then you have a state manager, which is Ember's other component, which it uses for mediating between different parts of the MVC. And to me, it almost feels like the state manager part should be in the controller here. I'm not sure. But they seem to have separated these parts out because, I don't know, it makes sense. Though I don't know if that's the best naming convention for this. And this is where it starts to unravel just a little bit. Again, Ember is amazing. But this makes it a little bit more tricky for me to understand how it actually fits into MVC. And this pipes back to ds.model, ember.view, ember.array controller, and the state manager that I mentioned before. We've got AngularJS, which as a Googler I should say you should go check it out. It's amazing. So again, they've got models which Angular is actually quite amazing when you give it time to fully understand it. It confused the fuck out of me when I first looked at it. So it's got this idea of single entity objects or entire data models, or all entities in your application, that are supposed to represent its models. This stuff is actually in your data binding. So does everyone know what data binding is? So I'm seeing a lot of people shaking their heads. Does anyone not know what data binding is? Okay, cool. So most of your models are actually in your data binding, which I found interesting. Then you've got views, which are rendered DOM elements based on what's in the controller and the model, which is fine. That's okay. And you've got controllers, and they've done something similar to what Ember did. They've broken it up into two different components. So you've got classes for augmenting something called an Angular scope. And the scope is really where I found at least a lot of the controller behavior. You have an API for observing models, an API for propagating model changes through the system. I don't know. I felt that this stuff better belonged in a controller. But once you actually start using it, it's pretty cool. It's a slightly different way of developing applications, but it's neat. And these pipe back to, so these, it was harder for me to sort of figure out where these actually pipe back to. But models are in your data bindings, views are in your templates, and the bindings between your view and your model. And then the rest of it is sort of in this scope object, which was interesting. We've got spine.js. How many people here use Spine or CoffeeScript fans? Okay. I won't spend too long on this. Spine's by Alex McCaw. Your models are essentially domain data. Spine does something interesting with the MVC pattern. So here, controllers bind to model events. Okay. Your views are HTML fragments or HTML templates. Same. Your controllers respond to DOM events. They render templates. They synchronize models and views. there's some stuff in here that it's doing that it perhaps shouldn't be. Is it really the controller's responsibility to be synchronizing your models and your views? But it also includes routers, so your hash fragment-based routing that Backbone does. And yeah, it sort of works, but its controller isn't entirely a controller. The Angular controller isn't either. Neither is the Ember one, and neither is the Backbone one. So why are we calling this all MVC? And Spine's specific components for Spine.model, your JavaScript templating of choice, Spine.controller, and Spine.route. Now everyone considers MVC something completely different. I don't know if this is a good thing or a bad thing. When developers first create their own JavaScript MVC frameworks, they typically try building on the experience they've had, creating complex applications and separating those out into components that make sense. And it's quite subjective. Some people will find, the idea of splitting those components out, so the idea of splitting your controller out into different pieces that work better with your framework, quite sensible. And, if there's good documentation and you use the thing for a while, it'll probably seem quite sane to you as well. But in my opinion, it can make it a little bit trickier for someone moving from what they consider to be an MVC framework to something labeled as an MVC framework that isn't. So before the discussion, we're going to look at a framework which tries to address some of these issues. It's very, very new. It hasn't been finalized just yet, but this is a framework by Peter Michels. And it's supposed to be closer to Smalltalk MVC. So it's called Maria. And in Maria, this is basically going to look like my description of Smalltalk. In Maria, you have your models which handle your domain data. Whenever your models change, it notifies the observers. Your views observe models, and they represent the model's current state. Also correct. Your collections, sorry, that says collections, and it should say controllers. I'm going to very quickly correct this because I'm ADD. You saw nothing. And I've got to fix the formatting. This is awesome. All right, here we go. So your controllers handle what happens when a user interacts with a view. Again, that's correct. And your routers are your own. One would argue, well, should a JavaScript MVC framework be providing you with lots and lots of other pieces? In this case, it prescribes the idea that, no, it shouldn't. Maybe you should be figuring out your own routing solution. I haven't used Maria enough to form an opinion about it, about whether it's better than the current approaches we have or not. But I'd love to hear people's thoughts on this quite soon. But basically, it doesn't have its own routing component just yet. It just gives you models, views, and controllers. And this pipes back to Maria.model, Maria.elementView, Maria.controller, and again, your own routers. This is the part of the talk where we're going to have a discussion. Is JavaScript MVC evolution, or is it abuse of a term that is quite popular and can get people looking at your library or framework? Is it wrong for people to be trying to fit, different paradigms or there are different perspectives of how application architecture should be structured into existing patterns? Is it right? Is it wrong? Are frameworks right to augment MVC? And does Smalltalk MVC have a place in JavaScript land? Does something that just provides you with these three components give you what you need? Should you be responsible for all the other parts? So I'm going to open the floor up now for people to come down and talk about this stuff, or we can just shout across the room, whatever works for you guys. I've got a few more slides I'm going to show you a little bit later about some new ideas that we've been looking at quite closely at Google for sort of new wave MVC. But yeah, I would love to hear people's opinions on this stuff. Does anyone have an opinion they'd like to share? All right. Would you guys like to come down? You don't have to stay down for the whole talk. You can shout. I don't mind. All right. Okay. All right. What's your question or comment?
Yeah. I'm a C++ programmer and I'm a JavaScript programmer. I've added two sides together.
Yep.
One of the biggest things I find with Internet and MVC on Java, JavaScript, is that you have latency for communicating with your.
Correct me if I'm wrong. Are you saying that in your architecture you have what are effectively packages of data coming back from the server whenever there are updates? That's actually really interesting.
Yeah, it's quite complicated language with this.
Mm.
The thing is that what you're able to do is you just hit the server with order requests and one that you need.
My own take in this is not to tell people to use MVC or not. My take is to just encourage discussion. So Is your take that MVC, if used as a base, is useful, but you have to have quite a lot of other extensions on top of your architecture to make it useful for the complex applications we develop today? Or is it that the pattern itself is outdated?
Honestly, it's outdated. It depends on, you need to have some form of coordinator to bring all the requests from various rules into one request. Otherwise, it becomes very slurry and chatty.
Yeah.
So strictly speaking, is that not outside of MVC? That's more of a change aggregator.
I just need to have extensions that we see so that we coordinate the requests in one go. It's almost like a mutex type approach.
Sure, but anything to do with request is outside of MVC. Because it's implying that you're going somewhere for data, whereas MVC, I don't think, implies that data is anywhere other than in the model.
Well, semantics, and I don't really mind putting my model something else into it.
Yeah.
But a lot of tools we use essentially JS program, we use a lot of MVC type technologies, but we don't find the more than one request inside one action. The whole model is fall apart.
I think as soon as remote as an idea bleeds into MVC, I don't like that. It's an orthogonal concern.
It's interesting. I'm actually going to talk very, very briefly. And if this is an implicit problem with sort of taking. So MVC was originally created for Smalltalk. We've used it across God knows how many programming languages since then. And I think the controller is possibly the most difficult part to adapt to a specific language. In JavaScript, this is why we've seen so many people trying to split it up, because what exactly is the controller? Is it just dealing with your DOM level interactions? Is it supposed to be dealing with a ton of other stuff that's more specific to working in the browser? Yeah.
So you're saying that the runtime there is effectively forcing the design pattern. Because you've got your templating in HTML, you've got it called up with.
It sounds familiar. I'm trying to think of the actual name of the pattern. It's probably another MVP variation.
Yeah. Paint it on the glass. Anything that happens once you click the button, DOM then files.
Started really looking at sort of this idea of shared models using controllers on the server side and client side, but they're starting to realize that that only really works if you're limiting what you're sharing. You can't just have sort of one set of a fixed structure on one side, another on another, and expect it all to be easily maintainable. It's just.
I think once you complete past validation
Yeah.
and verification, presuming knowledge that usually appears on the server is on the client,
Yeah.
that's where it is based out.
Yeah.
Everyone thinks reuse is great, and it is, but you're only going to reuse the.
When MVC was first being defined, it was actually not called MVC at all. It was called MVC-e with an additional component called the editor. And eventually they figured that there's not really a reason to be keeping this separate. And yet we find ourselves in this position today with the types of complex applications we're creating where we need to separate out the controller into other bits and pieces in some cases. Sometimes it does make sense to just have one place that's responsible for sort of modifying your models and taking care of everything else. Sometimes it doesn't. Sorry, go ahead. Yeah. Yeah. It comes down to how much logic exists in your client layer that you can't actually get done on the server side.
Is it a question of latency as well?
Yeah. Yeah. So how much of your application actually lives directly in the client without needing the server to be doing something in order to make everything happen inside it? Let's take an example of something like GitHub. So GitHub, everybody here knows GitHub. Whenever you're actually taking a look at a piece of code on GitHub that's been syntax highlighted, they, unlike many other sites, they actually do all of the syntax highlighting on the server for that. Very, very tiny example. But that's one case where it doesn't make sense to have client-side processing of data, and so having all of that process happen on the server makes a lot more sense. Wherever it makes, sense to actually be processing, where there's heavy processing that you don't want inside your client, I would move all of that stuff to the server where possible. there was a point made, I think, with the first question, this idea of, trying to save on latency, trying to save on HTTP requests by just pulling everything in as a package. I think that idea works really well if you want to be able to sort of split them in between. But it really depends on the type of application that you're creating. There are applications that can completely live offline and on the client side with very little server interaction. It's absolutely fine to be using JavaScript MVC for that without relying too much on the server. Where your processes are dealing with extremely dynamic data and the views themselves would take far too long, or you've benchmarked them and it take far too long to actually process in the client, that stuff belongs in the server in my opinion. But it really comes down to the type of application that you're working with. I don't think that there's a clear-cut answer about where it really just depends on what you're doing.
A lot of times nowadays a lot of applications are Ajax applications.
Yeah.
Lots of back and forth circulation.
Yeah.
So just
Up in the next couple of slides, but it really depends on the approach that you're taking to development. One sec. So let's get the slides. I was actually going to talk about the concept of offline first MVC, which is where one of the places Google will see people starting to develop applications in the future, in particular things that work inside Chrome. So the idea of offline first MVC is that you build your application keeping in mind offline first. So when someone first gets your application, regardless of whether there's a connection present or not, you persist all of your data locally, and when there is a connection available, you synchronize all of that stuff with the server. Now, in your example, if I were to do this and keep all of my application log, well, most of my rendered views, for example, and all of that stuff in server side, if I'm not actually going to be caching that stuff locally and not actually allowing people to work offline, that wouldn't really work. If your application, however, is extremely dependent on server-side logic and server-side rendering of views, and all that data can't be local. So let's say we had a betting application, for example, betting application rather than site. It wouldn't really make sense to make that offline, because what are you going to be able to do? You're not actually going to be able to place any bets. Storing any of that data offline doesn't really make sense because it's going to go out of date or not be particularly useful to you. But if I'm working with Google Docs, for example, having logic inside the client that can just exist there and persist using local data, even though that's a slightly thicker layer, means that regardless of whether I'm on a train and I've just lost my signal, I can still work on the client side. So it really depends, again, on the type of application that you're trying to create. Sorry. What? Yeah. Yeah. Oh, I'm not saying Google Docs does that. I'm just saying hypothetical example. I'm hypothetical example of stuff we may do in the future. Install the data required for a game offline. A version or a variation that says, okay, well, these features are enabled if you're completely offline and you can keep playing, and we'll synchronize all of your scores and all of the things that you've collected and done during the game as soon as there's a connection again. But it's very, very based on the context that you're working in. I think that comes back to what you were saying as well. All of this stuff is extremely context-based. Sorry, go ahead.
One thing I've noticed, with MVStar, about
Kyle Simpson, who created Lab.js, for example, he's tried coming up with alternative patterns over the past couple of years that are slightly more web-centric. They haven't completely really taken off. I think that we have a naming problem. We try to group this idea, okay, well, decouple everything, and we call it MVC, but maybe we should just be calling it decoupling and separating concerns rather than saying it's this particular pattern. As to whether we're going to come up with something better or a better set of patterns, I think we are already. A lot of what these frameworks are doing is they're creating their own derivatives of MVC, but they're not stepping out of the box and saying that that's what they've done in a lot of cases. And I think one reason is perhaps they don't want to really engage at a pattern level discussion, saying, okay, well, we're going to call this something completely different, because that then means that if someone goes to their project, they're going to be like, okay, you're using the WTF pattern. What exactly does that do? I'm used to MVC. Is that going to mean an additional learning curve for me? And maybe that's a factor in their decision process. Maybe they're saying it's MVC because it's going to be a little more friendly to people, and they'll say, okay, well, I've got a model and a view. That's enough for me. And then they'll actually go and invest time in learning the rest of it. I would like to see more framework authors actually trying to formalize some of the patterns that they're using. So if you're actually doing something other than MVC, say it, be proud of it, document it, let people actually explore that concept, because some of the ideas are actually not bad. Like I've seen, like a lot of people here are using Backbone at the moment, and many of us are probably augmenting it as well. Is Backbone in those contexts still MVP if we're creating additional bits and pieces to work with it? Is it something completely different? I don't know. I think that I would love for more people to actually start formalizing their ideas about structure and not just sticking to MVC. Yep.
The whole image stuff is very much
To facades to God knows. I use a lot of different stuff on top of it. I often find that whilst a lot of these frameworks are great for giving you sort of base functionality, once you create anything non-trivial, they're nowhere near enough. Like we've seen mediators. I use them in some crazy ways, like Nicholas Sikos, like you mentioned, does for like sandboxing and other sorts of craziness. Publish Subscribe, you guys are both using in your stuff as well. I think that it depends, because if framework authors are then going to take a look at sort of some of these other concerns that people are creating, does that then mean that they should start shifting away from what their most basic user might need? And this is, I guess, where I start seeing these other extension frameworks coming in more useful, because they're able to cater for the more complex use cases that, we as experienced developers or as people who've been doing this for a while, we probably appreciate. But we sometimes, lose scope of the fact that maybe the other 60 or 70% of people that are going to start looking at this stuff will get completely lost if we were to start teaching them about 10 other patterns that have to work into this stuff. So I think it's an interesting problem. It's perhaps not necessarily best targeted by framework authors, but again, going back to your point, I wish they would sort of at least try formalizing some of the extended concepts that they have if they're doing something different. Yep. To be honest, I'll talk about my experience with Backbone because it's the most. It's been interesting because there are a ton of different extension libraries. There's like Layout Manager, Marionettes, or which I've written, Thorax, etc. And the challenge is that sometimes not only is there an overlap in what they're trying to do, so you could easily have an extension library that says, okay, well, here are 10 things I do. Then another library which perhaps does 2 really, really interesting things, but also overlaps with what this one does, and you have to figure out, okay, well, how am I actually going to get these working? And then, of course, you have other concerns, like, are these actually going to be maintained? In a lot of cases, when these extension libraries get created, they're not being backed by the company. They're just getting, okay, well, I'm going to open source it, and the maintainability aspect of it becomes a real problem. Because once you start going away from, the prescribed framework that is perhaps being maintained by 10 or 15 developers to that little extension that may be just getting maintained by 1 or 2 people, you then have an extreme reliance on them actually continuing to develop the project, or you going in and having to do it yourself if you want to continue down that path of what they've chosen as their extensibility. I would say that's the biggest problem that I've had. Working with, so Derek Bailey in the Backbone world is quite a cool person. He's done Backbone Marionette, and the last, say, 3 or 4 versions of that extension have actually had completely API breaking changes. If I were to be writing a complex application, I think it's amazing. I think that the project itself is amazing. But if I were to be writing a complex application where I relied on something being created by one person, I think I'd have to be very, very careful about what extension libraries I'm actually using, especially once you go away from the main stuff. And maybe this is where people find themselves, writing their own custom components. Maybe that's why they do, because you have control over them. But my biggest problem has been reliance on what is not necessarily a project being backed by a lot of people. Sorry, go ahead. So you can use a YUI table. I mean, at the end of the day, it's completely up to you what components you use in your application. With YUI, I mean, maybe it makes more sense for you to be using YUI library as well as the YUI components just because it's made by the same company. If you wanted, I know people that use like YUI widgets and components and stuff with other frameworks, but it's entirely up to you. As long as you can make everything work and it's not going to end up too bulky, it's absolutely fine. Okay. Right. I'm not going to have time to go through the rest of the slides, but don't be pedantic. Use whatever feels the most maintainable option for you. Awesome. We've sort of gone through offline first MVC. The idea is basically create your applications with offline in mind first, and then work on the syncing part with the rest of the server. This is awesome because it means that your application, if it makes sense, will work regardless of whether there's connection or not. I was then going to talk about Harvey, which you guys should check out. It's a new framework based on Paul Irish's media element or mediaquery.js. But the idea, media element.js. Matchmedia.js. But the idea is that you can have device-specific views. So if somebody is sort of changing the size of a screen, or they're just sort of viewing your application on a different device, they'll get served a different view. It's just a concept that means that you're getting a slightly more customized experience. It's kind of cool. And I was going to talk about architecture extensions, but we've sort of covered that in the Q&A. And that's it. Thank you.